Welcome to Landmark Talks Property, a podcast by Landmark Information Group that covers all things property in short and intelligent podcasts.
Hello, welcome to this episode of our Property Trends podcast. My name is Mike Holden. Today we're going to be talking about our Property Trends report from Q2 2025. We'll go into more detail later on, but from a headline point of view, it's obviously been an interesting quarter as the market reacts to the closing of the stamp duty window at the end of Q1. So I'm joined by a panel of experts from Landmark here who can talk about what that means for specific segments of the market. So I'm going to introduce everyone to our experts here. As I look at it on my screen, first up, I've got Rob Gurney. Rob's Managing Director of Ochresoft, which is our conveyancing case management system. So Rob is the voice of the conveyancer on today's podcast. So hello, Rob.
Hello there.
Next on my list, I've got Richard Hepburn. Richard is the Managing Director of Landmark Scotland, and it'll be no surprise that Richard is the voice of Scotland on today's podcast. Hello, Richard.
Hello. Hi.
And next on my list, I've got Liz Jarvis. Liz is Director of Data, Legal and Search at Landmark, and we'll be talking conveyancing and search. So hello, Liz.
Hey, mate.
And last but not least, we've got Ben Robinson. Ben is Managing Director of Landmark Estate Agency Services. And again, absolutely no surprise that Ben will be the voice of the estate agent on today's podcast.
Right.
Hello. So if anyone is new to this podcast, what we'll do is go around our panellists and discuss the findings from the Q2 2025 Property Trends report. I'm going to start with the picture in England and Wales, and then move on to Scotland and talk about the market in Scotland. But before we talk to the panellists, I'll just give a bit of high-level view of the cross-market activity, which is where we start our Property Trends report. Before that, I should remind everyone the Property Trends report is available on Landmark's website, landmark.co.uk. So if anyone would like to read that in more detail and have a look at that while we're talking about it, or look at it at a separate time, take a look on the website. And I think that when we look at the cross-market activity, as I said at the top of the podcast, it's an interesting market that we're in that we've been at a quarter of the market kind of slowly picking up after the stamp duty window closed at the end of March. And to give an idea of the difference in activity we saw, March had a 79% year-on-year uplift in completions as people rushed to get their transactions through before the stamp duty deadline shut. April was 32% down year on year. So you can see that how that activity was all kind of pushed before the end of the window. And we've been kind of reacting to that ever since. And if we look at the kind of specific stats for the quarter, as we look at different parts of the process, we can see that the start of the funnel and the start of the process look pretty promising. Listings were up 5% year on year. But then as we get further down, sales subject to contract down 7% year on year, and completions down 20% year on year when we look at quarter to quarter. So what we're seeing is the market kind of pick itself up at the start of the pipe in listings, and then starting to flow through to SSTC and completion. But there's a whole load of activity that pulled forward in the process that we've been that's been working through, almost pipelines having to rebuild over the course of the quarter. I'm going to now pass on to Ben. Ben's going to talk about our market supply growth and demand supply variance charts. So first off, Ben, do you want to talk about the market supply and what we've seen in terms of listings in the estate agency world?
Yeah, no problem, Mike. I think, as you've already mentioned, the supply side, so properties coming to the market for sale, is actually particularly strong. It's 5% up year on year for the quarter. And actually, the first 2 months of that were 9% and 6%, respectively. That's April and May. It was actually came back into lockstep with last year in June, but actually last year was quite a strong year as well for supply. So what we've seen is plenty of properties on the market, and actually that's normally the early indicator of demand, because ultimately most people will be going on to move somewhere else. and we're not quite seeing that tie up a course.
Thanks, Ben. And in terms of the demand supply variance, firstly, do you want to talk about what that is, why we
Yeah.
measure it, what it tells us, and then what we saw in this quarter?
Yeah, we're basically looking at an indicator of the strength compared to last year. What was the strength of supply and what was the strength of demand year on year, and how does that interlink? Because ultimately, the two sides of the market, there's people who want to move, and then there's people who are going to buy. And actually, as I say, most of those sellers would normally be buyers, but if they can't sell, they, of course, struggle to buy. And what it's been showing us, although it's improved in the quarter, is it remained initially stable, which is actually lower normal. So what I mean by that is if demand strength is normal, there's a reasonable amount of stock, normally somewhere around 75 to 80% of stock coming to the market in any 1 month is selling, and that's a normal operating market. I think if you go above the 80s seen post-COVID, for example, with a massive rush, you get towards the 90s, that's an incredible amount. And I think all property professionals at that time saw that we had perhaps 10 buyers to every one property, and people were selling off market. It's a very different story post sort of that mini budget and the uncertainty that followed, and it's been slowly recovering over time. Now, which is what you've mentioned as well, is the story of this year has been that stamp duty. The end of the stamp duty change, in that the 5 months precursing that seemed to show a stronger demand space. So the demand was coming up, and it looked like we were going or holding a stronger market than last year, which is good because we should see it hopefully recover after the shock of a few years ago over time. And now actually since stamp duty, that's balanced back out to a similar demand strength to last year. And what that means is actually we are probably weaker normal. So there's this sort of missing link between people willing to sell and people being able to commit to buy, whether that's because they've not sold or they're not ready to. And of course, that comes into all the conversations around affordability. Are prices right? Are they affordable against the interest rate and what people can actually pick and the rules around borrowing? And that's probably not been the case. And then you get this sort of psychological difference between a seller. Yes, I want to move, but I want the highest price, but I want to buy the lowest price for the one I buy. And that's sort of been a missing link, I think, that's driven what we're hearing elsewhere, which is record numbers of properties. But that has then, in turn, delivered record numbers of price reductions. And I think we've seen Rightmove and Zoopla sort of reforecast their house price growth for this year to lower. And I mean, that's a symptom of all of what we're saying there is happening. There will be a place where we find some balance again, where people like, I now accept that this is the right value, and also sellers accepting, okay, I'm getting that for mine, but I'm probably going to get the same discount off what I buy. And then we start to see movement again. And looking at our numbers towards the end of that quarter, we did start to see those converge a little again. So hopefully that's a positive sign for moving forwards.
I think you're absolutely right on the balance part. It's something we're not going to dig into in a lot of detail in this podcast, but if you look at what's happening in the mortgage world, we're starting to see some more competition there, some improving rates. There's lots of options below 4% at the moment out there on the market. So that bodes well for that balance of affordability. I'm going to ask you a slightly unfair question because we didn't talk about this in the prep, but you talked about the stamp duty window and demand beforehand.
Yeah.
Versus after. Do you think that stamp duty change created more demand, or do you just think the balance of the demand across the year pulled forward?
Yeah, good question. And I guess there are similar things. It probably pulled forward, but I would have thought it also drove some people to make a decision because they might be considering moving in the next few years or committing, but thought, well, actually, this is the chance. This is now, I can afford it. But it does seem to have then created a slight chasm afterwards, which does suggest that a lot of that was come forward. And now, as I say, we're seeing weaker normal. So then the real market was probably still hovering around last year's because of that balance point that we've not quite reached yet. So,
yeah, thank you, Ben. And Rob, let's come to you next. We're looking at the conveyancer market activity. I'm going to talk about that for Q2.
Sure. Yeah. And I think, you've already sort of set the scene, Mike, in terms of from a conveyancer's perspective, since the SDLT end of a holiday period, there's been a steady recovery over the quarter. I think it's probably fair to say. Of course, from a completions perspective, massively decimated from an April, throughout the month of April, as you would expect. But I think probably one of the biggest sort of shocks to the system was just how long this SDLT holiday end, has taken from a recovery perspective. It certainly wasn't just a 1 month impact. It wasn't a do all of April's and March's completions all in the month of March. We're certainly still, what are we recording this podcast at the end of July? And I think we're still feeling the effects of that SDLT seismic shift that happened and the recovery off the back of it. So I think that's the first sort of thing to state, that people have been taken by surprise in terms of how long it's taken for this recovery to manifest itself, and like I say, is continuing as we speak. But in terms of how lawyers have reacted in terms of new cases coming through, in terms of conveyance instructions, I think this kind of gradual recovery has been seen both at the front end and the back end, but I think the impact on new instructions was very much less than the impact on completions, which I think shows that it's not a huge factor in terms of the buying decision making. We didn't sort of see a huge drop off in new instructions post SDLT holiday end. I think it's probably worth just having a little look at sort of the reasons why completions were so hugely impacted, between the months of April, May, and June. And it's basically, as what you've already alluded to, the age of cases, the pipeline was not mature, because so many cases that could complete by the end of March did, which left lawyers with an immature pipeline, and not just an immature pipeline, but a more complex transaction portfolio as well. The simpler cases are more likely to have completed pre SDLT change, and you're left therefore with early cases that aren't ready, and complex matters that by their very nature are not ready either. So I think that they're probably the biggest factors in why we saw such a huge drop off, and such a sort of a steady recovery, and not an instant recovery, during the last quarter.
I think it's really interesting, because I think we were thinking in April that the market was taking a well-earned holiday, that stamp duty window closed pretty much in perfect time with the Easter holidays starting, and so we felt like that drop in April was understandable, but it was surprising that it took so long to pick back up, and it didn't bounce back more in May and June. But I think you've explained really why that's the case, and that it's less mature and more complex cases that still need more work to get them through the pipeline.
Yeah, I think there was some unfair comments about conveyances at the time, certainly in April, where people were sort of suggesting, well, you did this amount of work in March, you got these completions through in March, why can't you do that every month? And it wasn't because conveyancers necessarily took their foot off the gas in April and May and June. It's more just a case of you can only complete what's in front of you, and if they're not ready, then they're not ready. So yeah, I think that's it was slightly unfair to suggest that there was a lack of effort involved in the drop off in completion numbers.
Yeah, that makes absolute sense.
Mm.
And next up, there's the completions to instruction ratio. Again, similar to the question for Ben, what is it? Why do we measure it? What does it tell us, and what does it tell us about last quarter?
So yeah, we do measure completion to instructions as a percentage, and because primarily it's sort of quite a good indicator of the sort of how lengthy and large conveyancers portfolios might be in terms of transaction numbers. If there's a decent or a higher percentage of completions to instructions, then it shows, a nice sort of throughput and a nice sort of healthy positioning between those two numbers. Whereas if we have a lower percentage, and we sort of can see trends appearing in terms of month after month of low percentage, that suggests that potentially there's a build up of cases in the conveyancing process that could lead to bottlenecks and delays, etc. So it's always sort of useful to have an eye on it, but also there's often different dynamics going on, different stories that would explain some of the numbers. The reason that the CEIR is so sort of interesting this quarter is actually April 2025, we recorded our lowest ever completion to instruction ratio since we've been looking at this. And it was at 32%. So you can see how much the completion number dropped off to get to such a low CAR percentage. And just for context, Mike, the last stamp duty cliff edge that we witnessed, which I think was end of June 2021, the following month, which was July 21, that CIR was at 47%. And we got down as far as 32 in April. So I think what that shows is just what a monumental effort went into completing absolutely anything that could have completed before that deadline, which left the big gulf in completion numbers in the month of April. I think, Mike, if I may, just one closing remark, because I know we're talking about this quarter in particular we've just sort of said goodbye to, but despite the huge volatility and the subdued quarter that we've had, if you look at the half one numbers, completions are actually up 8% compared to the same first half of last year. So, despite the huge, stamp duty rush, and despite the big drop off post SDLT holiday, if you sort of put all of that into the pot, we're actually 8% up on completion numbers in the first 6 months of this year versus last.
That's really interesting. Thanks, Rob. It kind of goes back to the question about is it reallocating work that was going to happen across the months, but the fact that as of 6 months we're up on last year is a positive sign in terms of overall market.
It's just a shame that we have to be on this huge roller coaster journey to get there, and it's not just a lovely sort of smooth gradient.
It's feast or famine.
Yeah.
Also fascinating that the completion to instruction ratio was lower than the previous two stamp duty window closing, because there were bigger pounds and pence savings to be had, beating those ones than there was this year's one. So you'd expect there to have been more of an impact, but interesting that the biggest impact was this time.
Yep.
Thank you very much, Rob. Fascinating. Next up, Liz has been waiting very patiently. Liz, can you tell us about search market trends in quarter two, please?
Sure, Mike. Well, we're up about 2% in this quarter on the same period in the year before, which is disappointing really, because last year in that period it was pretty depressed. So we would have hoped for a bigger uptick this year. But at the risk of saying what they said in terms of Ben and Rob, that stamp duty threshold changing at the end of March really had a massive impact. And I think I would definitely agree with Ben that probably the majority of it was them rushing things through. And that's why we've seen this, really to quote again, this chasm appearing afterwards. Because typically what happens in search is people will begin to order up their diligence packs, getting towards the end of the transaction. So for us, what we see typically through May and June are the builder months, where people are trying to get ready to move into their properties before everyone disappears for the summer holidays. Mm-hmm. And we just did not see that this year. We didn't see that building. So it's left us in a position whereby we're a bit uncertain as to how we're going to see autumn now, because the spring and the autumn are typically our two busiest times of the year. And it's not augured very well for us in spring. So whilst I think everyone's predicting modest growth and things improving, these complex chains that are still around, what they're showing is that there's definitely buyer momentum out there. People want to move, but they're not going all the way through to the completion and the ordering up all the diligence at the other end. So we're seeing this activity, but there's too many fall throughs are coming, or things are just taking an astoundingly longer period to complete than they typically do. So that's what we're seeing in environmental and other diligence searches, Mike. So it's like it's anybody's guess really what we're going to see now in the autumn. Hopefully we'll continue to see it build with some growth, but I don't think it will be a typical year.
That's really interesting, Liz. And I think on day of recording, we've just seen the Bank of England release mortgage approval figures for June, which look promising, and they're increased month on month and year on year. But I think the point you made is a really interesting one, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to complete a mortgage approval. And that's, we're seeing subdued completion, subdued searches suggest that that may well be the case, those extended transaction times.
Yes, because I think it goes back to that old adage that time kills deals. So the longer things take to conclude, people have got a longer period of time to maybe start looking around again. They get a better offer. All sorts of things can happen within that period, which is stymieing the completions.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Thank you very much, Liz. Thank you, Rob and Ben, as well, for all your insights on England and Wales. And incredibly patiently in the background, we've had Richard, our Scottish representative. So let's talk about Scotland. Richard, can you talk to us about what we're seeing in Scotland?
I can, Mike. Thanks for that. I suppose the big thing to start off with, in contrast to England and Wales, is that we didn't experience the market distortion effect of up here land and buildings transaction tax changes in April. We didn't have any changes in LBTT as our SDLT equivalent. So in that regard, it's probably a bit of a cleaner market to have a look over. For sure, we've got some of the same economic factors, challenges of mortgage affordability and balancing that with price. They apply just as much up here. But overall, the position was just, I think, calmer and less volatile in England. Listings very strong. I'll come on to detail about that in a minute. Slightly more sticky demand, but really improving as the quarter went on, and real clear signs of improvement as we exited May into June. So I can go into that in a bit more detail.
Yeah, that's I think the interesting thing on the completion side kind of echoes what Liz was saying, doesn't it? About that more stable market, the different process in Scotland sees less of an impact coming through to completions.
Yeah, definitely. So, I mean, if we look on it, our equivalent on the kind of market and demand supply, I mean, we had a really healthy quarter in terms of listings. We're about 14% up overall on Q2 of 2024. May being particularly strong, it was up 21% in May over last year. So clear signs of a market that's looking, or certainly sellers out there looking to get moving. Demand did drop off a bit from late March through April into May, and then we saw a recovery in June. So we're still about 3% down on prior year for the quarter. But I think the key thing here is that other public commentators in the market are certainly suggesting that home report and viewing requests have really increased, and they're well above where they were last year. So that augurs well for where we end up for Q3.
What I always find fascinating is that there is less of an impact when big events happen in terms of stamp duty, etc., in England and Wales on Scotland. You'd always think there would be some cross-border moving and activity, which would mean that there might be a slight impact in Scotland, but it never seems to be the case.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's probably lots of factors for that. I mean, we've talked in previous podcasts about the Scottish process, but I think it's just inherently a bit more stable. And it does have, I mean, obviously the benefit of lower average house prices here, which I think Ben's looked at this in the past, that there's probably closer parallels in the north of England where house prices are more comparable to what happens in Scotland, and so that's definitely a factor. I think the dynamics of the southern English market, create a 2 or 3 markets in England as opposed to one in Scotland.
Yeah.
I think in terms of where we are, I mean, core searches here are typically ordered right after sales, subject to missives have been agreed. So when a contract's been agreed, as I said, these were slightly below last year, but we really started to see that picking up when we exited May. So I think, as you talked about earlier about greater mortgage rate stability in recent months, I think it's definitely been a factor there, given a bit more confidence to buyers and sellers.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Richard. Anything more on Scotland before we
Yeah, I just think to say, obviously, we saw completion numbers here were about up 1%. So, again, no real distortion there. And May again was up 9%. So we saw some softening in June, but that's probably down to the fact Scottish holiday season kicks off about a month earlier than England. So that clearly is a factor. I think one thing just to finish with, and worth flagging, is really the greater stability here around valuations, Mike, as you know, with a home report setting an expectation for the seller of what they're going to get for their property, and that being carried out by a surveyor. There's definitely been less price drops here, or the need to drop prices, which is clearly an issue in England at the moment. And in fact, I think I saw on some recent public commentary from other places that Scotland's the only region in the UK to have prices higher than 2024 at the moment. Prices are increased. So that's a sign of better market stability on pricing as well.
Yeah, it certainly is. It certainly is. Thank you very much, Richard. Now, before we bring things to a close, I'm going to put everyone on the spot and ask for a quick view about how we think the next quarter is going to look. And I'll start at the start of the transaction. So, Ben, from the estate agency side, you're up first. What's your view on next quarter?
I think it'll be slightly more in balance, demand and supply. I think there's so much stock out there with so many price drops now. People are probably wondering whether to put their property on the market, but also then that drives that next stage, which is people's affordability. I think with one thing I didn't mention earlier really is obviously in a buyer's market where they have choice, you do get less stable transactions because of the way our system works, in that, there's quite likely something else that suits you as well. You could be a little bit fussier, and I think we've seen that, but agents can't keep afford to do half of the work for free, where they're paid on completion. Things have to change. I know there's a lot of work into trying to get more information up front to bring more certainty and more commitment sooner. But I do think just that market balance coming back and looking at the end of the quarter, the demand supply variance starting to come back, back here into a more positive position. I do think there'll be better throughput. I can't see it, being a huge jump. I think we're back on that steady path to a normal market.
Perfect. Thanks, Ben. Rob, from the conveyancer side,
what Ben said, basically. I'm only joking. No, I mean, just looking at the trends, that from the quarter that just gone, we are in a subdued market, but things are improving, and they're improving at the front end and the back end. And in terms of recovery to last year's position, so I don't necessarily see that's needs to change or will change. There's the more new cases that go through to lawyers equals more completions. You would hope that certainly should be how it works logically. So, despite all of the difficulties that we've talked about on this podcast, in terms of why things take so long and why things fall through and all of that kind of stuff, the more cases that come through to sold subject to contract equals the more that theoretically should go through to completion, albeit delayed and frustrated. But yeah, so subdued but improving.
Thanks, Rob. I think pretty much anyone in the market would take stable growth over the roller coaster that you talked about in the first half of the year. Liz, how about you?
Well, I definitely agree with you, Mike, that everybody is quite happy to see that slow improvement. And I think that that's exactly what it's going to be. There is nothing to indicate it will be anything other than that. I think that we'll continue to see, certainly for my area of the business, a couple of percentage points above where it was this time last year. The Bank of England potentially reducing the rate again in August. People are predicting that will all help, but that will not flow through quickly enough, I don't think, for us to see much uplift in the autumn. So again, I'm afraid I'm echoing my colleagues here. Improvement, but slow and relatively subdued.
Thanks, Liz. And Richard, how about Scotland?
I don't want to be so negative. I think we'll have a slightly better performance in Q3. I think if you read the tea leaves there, listings really good. Things picking up as we headed out of Q2. People back from holiday, we're starting to see volumes better than July last year by a good amount at the moment. So that's all auguring well for a really strong sort of late summer autumn. So
Thanks, Richard.
I'd like to think, I'd say 5%, Mike. I think we'll be 5% up, so we can come back to that in the next podcast and see whether I was right or wrong.
I look forward to that. I think that the key word is affordability, and you touched on the different average price in Scotland being a factor, interest rates creeping down, more competitive mortgage products on the market. So and prices in England and Wales coming down for property. We reach that equilibrium of affordability, and then demand kicks in. So I think it's that's the key thing we're keeping an eye on. So thank you very much to everyone for listening. Thank you very much for our panelists, to Rob, to Richard, Liz, and to Ben. Thank you for your brilliant insight. It just leaves me to remind everyone that you can read our property trends report on Landmark's website, landmark.co.uk, and we look forward to speaking to you again in 3 months. Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening to Landmark Talks Property. If you've enjoyed today's podcast, please hit subscribe. This podcast is for general purposes only. The views expressed are those of the hosts and guests and do not constitute professional advice.